Hello, and welcome to our video on lipids, and we will go into just what you need to know about lipids for our microbiology class. Alright, and just like we did with carbohydrates, lipids also have a function in our biology of life, and in that they are mostly used for long-term energy storage. As you'll see, there's a lot of bonds to break in these long lipid chains, and each one of those can be broken to get more and more energy. Okay, and then we'll see that these actually make up our cell membranes, and we'll talk about those more in our cell chapter. And then they are used for insulation for obvious reasons. Cholesterols make steroids. Steroids are like testosterone. Those are also lipids, and then there are also oil-based paints or pigments in plants and other creatures, even bacteria. All right, so let's get into the characteristics of lipids. Okay, so most of them are nonpolar and hydrophobic. They'll form these big long chains that we'll see, and they are nonpolar. Okay, remember water is polar. Okay, it kind of has a slight negative charge and two slight positive charges over here. And remember, this is water. Okay, so when this long chain comes into contact with the polar water, it wants to avoid it, okay, at all costs. And that is called hydrophobicity or hydrophobic. And that literally means water hating. Okay, hydro water, phobic hating, just like a phobia. Okay, the functions of lipids we kind of already talked about: long-term energy storage, building blocks for hormones, and our plasma membranes. And there are a variety of types of lipids. I mentioned the steroids, and the typical fatty acids are what we'll be talking about, and phospholipids are what we see in the cell membrane. Okay. So I kind of said it a couple of times that lipids form the classic fatty acid. Anyway, lipid forms these long chains, and each one of those is energy to break, albeit very specifically. You can't just choose where you want to break it, but if you don't have any double bonds, right, it'll all look like this. It'll all look like a single bond, and those are all covalent bonds, covalent bonding between the carbons. And if you don't have any double bonds, you get what's called a fat. Fats will lay on top of one another in these nice sheets, making a solid at room temperature, and that's why we call it 2-fat. These are generally found in animals over plants. Okay, and like I said, if you see this double bond here, that is called an unsaturated fatty acid. Okay, no longer saturated with hydrogen, but it is unsaturated, and this will actually form a kink in the molecule, and all those kinks prevent the flatness of the molecules from laying on top of one another, and these are called oils at room temperature because they stay liquid. Okay, and so you can have mono unsaturated, like olive oil, and it's kind of like thicker, and then you can have poly unsaturated, which is like canola oil. All right, so those are fatty acids, and we can kind of see how they would lay on top of one another to be called saturated or unsaturated. Okay, and you might have heard of trans fats. Okay, trans fats being the bad cholesterol. Well, trans just means that those hydrogens are on the same, are on the opposite side of one another, and so that does allow them to kind of lay flat. But you don't really have too many trans fats in nature. They're kind of like made. And for the most part, you'll find them in the cis orientation, and that's what makes them nice and oily. Okay, so this brings us to the next type of lipid, which I mentioned, which is the phospholipid. Remember when I mentioned the types of groups, chemical groups you needed to know? Well, that phosphate group is right here. This is called the hydrophilic head, and the phosphate that I alluded to is actually here. And that phosphate on top of the glycerol will make a hydrophilic head, and that actually has a charge, a negative charge, and so that will attract the two hydrogens on water, okay, and get the waters to face that part. Meanwhile, the hydrophobicity of these long hydrophobic tails will be away from the water and try to hide from the water. Okay, and so that principle sets up what's known as like encapsulation, right? And so these things will tend to arrange themselves, forming these what's called a liposome or micelle, or even just a lipid bilayer sheet. And this is kind of evident when you see oil droplets in the water. You'll put oil on top, and they'll all kind of like make these little bubbles together, and it would look a lot like this, even though they're not so bilayery. It would look more like this. Okay, but then the cell, and we'll see in the cell chapter that all of our cell membrane looks like this. Okay, so our cell membrane is the phospholipids. Cell membrane. Okay. Alright, and that will bring us to the conclusion of lipids. So most of them are serve as vitamins, and they can be fat soluble. It seems kind of counterintuitive that lipids are, but they're not fats that are, they're just lipids. So, but the fats that we eat and consume serve as long-term energy storage, and they'll provide insulation for the body, of course. And then you need to consume healthy fats in order to keep up your cell membrane motility and your hormone health. All right, and with that, we'll see you in nucleic acid.